All right, let's dive into another deep dive. Um, Today we're going to be talking about something pretty heavy, the human rights situation in Syria.
Okay.
We're looking at a blog post from Investor, and it's called The Torture and Disappearance of Syrians.
Yeah.
So, we really want to get a sense of how this conflict, impacts real people.
Right. I think that's so important. It's easy to get lost in the headlines and forget that behind all the numbers are actual human stories.
Absolutely. And this blog, it really makes you feel that, doesn't hold back. One thing that jumped out at me was how systematic the torture is. I mean, it really paints this picture of the regime using brutality like a deliberate strategy.
Right. Yeah. It's not random violence.
Yeah.
Right. It's very calculated. It seems like there are, specific political objectives at play here.
So can you break that down for me? What's the thinking, like the political logic behind using torture so systematically?
Well, it seems that, in this case, the regime is trying to hold on to power, right?
Right.
And they're using torture as a tool, like a very effective tool, to crush anyone who disagrees with them. To basically instill this, like, deep fear and control the entire population.
Yeah, it's like this mass intimidation tactic, right? Someone speaks out, they get punished brutally, and everyone else is too terrified to even think about saying anything.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And that fear can basically paralyze an entire population, right?
Yeah.
It makes it almost impossible to organize any kind of opposition.
The blog goes into some pretty rough details, about the methods they use. Things like beatings, electrocution.
Yeah.
It's hard to even read,
Mm.
But I think it's important to really understand how brutal it is.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to note that, these methods, they're not just about causing physical pain,
Right.
they're deeply psychological.
Right.
They want to completely break a person's spirit,
Yeah.
to humiliate them, to make them totally subservient.
And it seemed like things got even worse after those protests, the pro-democracy ones in 2011.
Right.
I mean, it feels like the regime just saw any kind of dissent as like an existential threat, and they responded with like just overwhelming force.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The regime saw those protests as a direct challenge, to their authority.
Yeah.
And the brutality we're seeing now, it's like a direct response to that.
So it's like they're not just punishing individuals, they're trying to send a message to everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, don't even think about challenging us.
Or else.
Or else.
Right. Wow. Okay, that makes sense, but it's still just horrifying. Now, the blog also talks about, besides the torture itself, this other terrifying thing, enforced disappearances.
Right.
So can you talk about what that is and how it kind of fits into this whole strategy of control?
So enforced disappearance is when someone is, like, taken,
Yeah.
right, usually by the government or people working for them,
Okay.
and then they just disappear.
Yeah.
No one knows where they are.
Right.
It's like they're completely cut off from any kind of legal protection from society, and their families are left in this horrible, like, limbo.
It's like they're just swallowed up, gone.
Exactly.
And it seems like the Syrian regime is using this as another way to silence dissent and, just control everyone.
Right. Just imagine the impact that has on people,
Yeah.
One day, someone is just gone.
Right.
No explanation, no anything.
Poof.
Yeah, poof. And people start to, like, self-censor.
Right.
They become afraid to say anything, even at home.
It's terrifying. And the torture that the families go through, I mean, it's not just losing a loved one, it's not knowing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The blog actually tells the story of Mehram, a university student who was detained and tortured multiple times.
Wow.
And it shows how these disappearances, they just ripple outward, and traumatize entire families and communities.
It's just heartbreaking. And there's that other story, too, about the father who's desperately looking for his son, just hitting dead end after dead end. I mean, that feeling of helplessness must be just crushing.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a key part of this whole strategy, right? This complete lack of accountability.
Yeah.
It sends this message that they're above the law, that they can do whatever they want, and no one can stop them.
It's just, it's so bleak. It's so heavy. But there is, this one thing in the blog that's actually incredible. It talks about, people trying to actually document all these horrible things.
Right.
Like, it mentions over 600,000 pages of,
Wow.
intelligence documents that were smuggled out of Syria.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a massive amount of evidence.
That's huge. And it could actually, like, really change things.
Oh, so.
Well, think about it, right? It's like having all these pieces of a puzzle, and they can reveal how this whole brutal system works.
Okay.
Like, who gave the orders, how they actually did it, who was involved.
So it's not just people telling their stories. There's, like, hard proof.
Exactly. And that's why this kind of documentation, it's crucial in these situations.
Hmm.
It gives you the proof you need to build a case, right?
Yeah.
To actually go after these guys and make sure they don't get away with it.
It's like shining a light on all the, the dark stuff and saying, we see you and we're not letting you get away with this.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it brings us to this guy, Mazen Hamada.
Right. The blog mentions him.
Yeah. He used to live in Syria, and he's dedicated, like, his life to documenting these crimes.
Wow. Can you tell us more about him and what he does?
Well, his story is really interesting. He actually used to work for the Syrian government,
Oh,
but
wow.
then he left and joined the opposition.
So he's not just some outsider. He knows how the system works.
Exactly. And he's using that knowledge to expose the truth. Like, he's collecting evidence, interviewing people who've survived, trying to build a case against the regime. But it's incredibly dangerous work.
I can imagine. He's risking his life to do this.
Yeah, he's constantly getting threats.
Wow.
He could be targeted by the regime,
Hmm.
but he's determined to make sure the world knows what's happening.
It's amazing. So while individuals like him are fighting for justice, what about the international community? I mean, are they doing anything?
Well, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I mean, there's been a lot of criticism that they're not doing enough to stop all this.
Right. The blog kind of mentions that, like, there's a lot of talk, but not a lot of action. So what's going on there?
Well, part of it is it's complicated, right?
Yeah.
Syria has all these alliances and different countries involved,
Right.
and everyone has their own agenda, so it's hard to get everyone to agree on what to do.
So everyone's kind of afraid to do anything because they don't want to mess things up even more.
Exactly, yeah. And there's also this worry that, if they do get involved, it'll just make the fighting worse
Right.
or even
Sure.
start a bigger war. It's a very, very delicate situation.
So even though it seems like morally they should do something, there's also that fear of, making things worse.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of led to this, like, everyone's just stuck.
Right. But even with all that, are there any ways to actually get justice? Can these people be held accountable?
Well, I think it's important to remember that, justice can take a long time.
Yeah.
We've seen, war criminals get prosecuted years after the fighting ends.
So there are examples of people being held accountable, even in these really complex situations.
Right. And there are groups, organizations out there who are dedicated to, collecting evidence,
Right.
building cases against the people responsible. They're making sure that when the time comes, they'll be ready.
So it's not just about waiting for like some big political shift. It's about preparing for when that moment comes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where people like Mason are so important, right?
Right.
Their work is like the foundation for getting justice, no matter how long it takes.
God, it's like inspiring to hear about people like him, like refusing to let these things be forgotten. It does give you like some hope, even with all this awfulness. But man, I gotta say, this whole deep dive, it's left me feeling kind of heavy.
Yeah.
I mean, what can we even do, like, as individuals, when we see this kind of injustice happening so far away?
I totally get that feeling.
Mhm.
It's easy to feel like powerless.
Yeah.
But even just being aware of it, I think that's powerful in itself.
Okay.
Like, we learn about these things, we talk about them, we share the stories, then we can start to change how people think.
Right.
And that can create pressure for real change.
So it's like giving a voice to the people who are being silenced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there are other things we could do too, like donating to organizations that are actually working in Syria,
Right.
supporting activists, contacting our politicians and telling them we want them to do more.
So even if it feels like it's, a world away, there are things we can do to help.
Absolutely. And every little bit counts. Change doesn't happen overnight, but every little thing adds up.
Yeah. That's a good point. We can't just like ignore it and pretend it's not happening.
I agree. I mean, staying silent, that's almost like you're part of the problem.
Right.
But when we speak up, when we get involved, then we're choosing to stand with the people who are suffering.
That's really well said. This deep dive, it's definitely given me a lot to think about. I mean, the human cost of this conflict, it's just enormous.
Yeah.
But seeing how resilient the Syrian people are and, how dedicated people are to fighting for justice, it does give you hope.
I think that's the biggest takeaway,
Mm.
Even in the darkest times, people can still find strength.
Yeah,
And the fight for justice, even though it's long and hard, it's always worth it.
that's so true. Well, thank you so much for taking us through all of this.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
It's such a complex and challenging topic, and I feel like I understand it so much better now.
I'm glad to hear that. And hey, if anyone listening wants to learn more, there's a ton of information online, and organizations that are focused on human rights in Syria.
Right.
So, yeah, keep learning, keep talking about it, keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. And thank you all for listening to this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.